We are continuing our class this quarter on God's expectations for the Christians, and in such a sea of responsibility that we have, it is very difficult for us to narrow this down, and so we come into this knowing that there's so much that's not going to be covered, but I hope what you'll see in all of these is a thread of some ongoing responsibilities that we have as Christians that God has given to us, that we have an opportunity really truly all the time to fulfill these things. And in the fulfilling of all of those things, we are helping the church to be stronger. We are putting it in a position to where it can grow. And when you think of that growth, not just in terms of numerically being a bigger number, but growing in the closeness and love that we ought to have. And so I hope as we look at the class today that we're going to see the ongoing necessity of this. You'll see that the Christian expectation that we're looking at this week is to comfort one another, and it almost seems like a sequel of last week's class. We talked about encouraging one another, and you'll see that there is somewhat of an overlap. We'll talk about that more in a moment. When we talk about the difference between encouragement and comfort, how would you put a point on that distinction? What's the difference between you being an encourager of others and you're being a comforter of others?
Comfort's more all-encompassing. Comfort can include, encouragement can too. It's not the easiest question in the world, Reverend.
Okay, all right. Well, that's why I'm asking it. I want you to think about it. Comfort and encouragement.
You can include material things in comfort that you might not include in encouragement. Encouragement might be more emotional.
Okay.
It depends on your heart, your walk with the Lord.
Okay. Patrick says one may be more material and the other may be more emotional.
I think of comfort as helping someone who's in pain or sorrow.
Okay.
Whereas encouragement sometimes can, but doesn't always. It may be just lifting up, patting on the back and.
All right, so one is more in regards to sorrow or difficulty where they need consolation, and encouragement may be have a more positive side to it. Yes, ma'am.
And tagging onto that, comfort is kind of after the fact.
Yeah?
Whereas encouragement can be both after the fact or just in general.
Okay, so one's before the fact, one's after the fact. So proactivity on the part of encouragement. Now, encouragement may happen with regard to somebody who's discouraged. So there's a negative thing there, and you are coming alongside, but there is certainly a difference. Garnett?
I think of encouragement as looking more toward the future, and comfort as being more toward the present.
Excellent. Very good. Now, I think that this is an important question because what you're going to find is there is one word that is found throughout the New Testament that is the main word for encouragement and comfort. It's the same word. It's the word parakaleo, and that word indicates to come alongside of. And maybe we have talked about this with regard to important passages in New Testament books. When you find that word parakaleo, and it's often translated, I urge, or I beseech, I plead with you. Usually what the New Testament writer says after that is extremely important. And in many cases where you find this word, it is the key verse in that particular book. I think of the book of Romans, chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, and 1 Corinthians 1, verse 10, and Philippians chapter 4 and verse 2 is just three examples off the top of my head where that word, the word we've been looking at, is found. But it's going to be when the context kind of highlights for us when it's preemptive, when it's somebody who may be about to go into a valley and we're trying to keep them from going into that. And then sometimes it's the fact that we get there after the damage is done. And we have a responsibility in both of those cases. So just to kind of highlight what you guys have said, encouragement focuses on strengthening, urging, or motivating somebody to action, to hang on, don't to let go of your faith, or to be faithful. And it's often, as was said, forward-looking and it's proactive. And comfort focuses more on soothing and consoling or alleviating emotional or spiritual distress, often in response to what? Suffering. Grief. Comfort's more about emotional restoration than it is urging in action. In encouragement, you may be trying to get somebody off the bench and into the game, and in comfort, really that's not what's at play at the moment. There is an immediate crisis of hurt that needs to be resolved, and we're stepping into that gap in order to provide that. And so we see different words that are used in the New Testament, but the main word we're going to look at is that same word that we mentioned. And since God commands Christians to engage in comforting one another, it makes it a Christian expectation. And it's a powerful way that we as Christians can accomplish the will of God in a fallen world full of bad news. So here's the question: how do we equip ourselves to comfort those who are in need of that? I want to do two things that I think are very unusual for this class. First of all, I want to use as our main text a text out of the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament is looking at the church in prospect, but certainly it's dealing in a different time. And I actually want to go in the Old Testament before the old law has been established. So we're going to spend our time, if you want to go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Job chapter 2, verse 11 through 13. That's where we're going to spend our time. And second, our example is going to be probably the worst comforters in the entire Old Testament as an example for how we should give comfort today. All right, so look at Job chapter 2. We're going to look at verse 11 through 13. Here it is. Now, when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and to comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. I think that there are at least, and I was talking to Kathy this morning, I isolated what I think are 6 important principles of comfort, and I think I've left out at least a couple. So maybe you can clean up for me after I'm done here and tell me if there's some other principles in addition to the 6 that we're going to look at. 6 principles that if we as Christians today can employ these and use these in the body, but also in our relationship with those who are lost in the community, it can help us to meet the expectation that God has for us as Christians. So, number 1, make the decision. Do you notice, how did we find in this text that they made the decision to comfort? They made an appointment, right? And to highlight this, I don't guess I'd ever looked at this before. Where were these guys coming from? Do you notice that they all have a different tribe, a different city, or a different place that they're coming from? Didn't you in your mind just think that they were all together in the same place and maybe they had to walk across the street in order to get to Job? But that's not the case at all. I don't know how the word got out. I mean, it was such a calamity. You know how bad news spreads so quickly. I'm sure that, and especially Job being a superlative in all the land, maybe one of the greatest people of his lifetime. And when you hear such a reverse of fortune, having lost everything, the word doesn't just get out, it really spreads. And I kind of looked into where these guys are coming from. That's an approximation. Can you see Uz in the middle there? Job was from the land of Uz. It's opposite of Jerusalem. Do you see that? That's where he was at. But I want you to notice where it's possible that they would have come. You see Tema down there? I don't know how big it shows up behind you, but you see right next to that says Eliphaz the Temanite. If they're from the same area of Edom, then it's possible that Eliphaz, who seems to be the leader of this group, judging from Job chapter 42 and verse 7, he's coming between 10 to 50 miles in order to go and to provide comfort for Job. In ancient times where the main mode of transportation is probably going to be either by foot or by beast of burden, and so you're not getting there very quickly. But it's when we begin to look at the other friends that we see what was so important about them making the decision to go and do this. Naamah, if depending on where it is, and we're not exactly sure where it's at, but it's probably in northwest Arabia, and if that's the case, then he came between 150 and 200 miles. But if it's further west, then we're talking about maybe 200 to 400 miles. But then we look at Shua, Bildad the Shuhite. We really don't know where that is, but educated guesses that are made would put that in northwest Arabia, but further east, and he would have come 200 to 300 miles. But it's very likely that it's Mesopotamia, they believe, and if that's the case, then we're talking about 500 to 700 miles. First of all, that the news spread that far, but that a friend lived that far flung from Job and made the decision to come to him. And I thought about what's perspective for that. If you and I were to try to figure, if you wanted to walk to Times Square, or if you wanted to walk to Disney World, or if you wanted to walk to watch a Toronto Blue Jays home game, or a Texas A&M home game, that's the amount of time that we're talking. And it's not just that. If you were to go to any of those events, those are relatively joyful and fun and entertaining things to go and do. But can you imagine going that distance in order to comfort a grieving friend? So I don't want us to miss that there is a sacrifice involved anytime we reach out to comfort somebody. And it begins in the mind. You have got to make the decision to do this. It's not just an automatic. And so you notice these men deliberated, and they counted the cost in terms of the time that it would have taken. What's the logistics involved? These are probably wealthy men, so maybe they had a retinue of folks who were coming with them, and so there's expense involved in having others to come with them. And then, of course, we're going to see that there's an emotional expense that they're going to pay, and they do all of that to make an appointment to come to see Job. Now, when you think about the early church and their time together, you know, there's a lot of different ways that we look. Did the early church enjoy being together? So there's a lot of mention, and you think about the environment in which the church was born. The church is born in a time of controversy. Jews are leaving the religion that they have been following for well over 1,000 years, and they're following this one that had been such a divisive teacher among them. And yet there's this decided highlight as you go throughout the book of Acts, and you see how there's joy that epitomizes their time together. You'll walk throughout the New Testament and you'll find principles that teach this. You know, Paul says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 15 that we're to rejoice with those who rejoice and we're to weep with those who weep. And so we find the early church, no doubt, and examples of this who were doing that. And then the very beginning of the church, in Acts chapter 2, verse 46 and 47, they gladly received the word, they met together, they had fellowship together, they sold their possessions, but in the middle of all of that, it says they took their meals with gladness. There was this desire to be together that was positive, that was an encouraging thing. You know, you even think about the assemblies, and I hope that nobody ever, and maybe there are times where all of us feel obligated to come to church services. But hopefully as our relationship grows with Christ, it's not just I'm there, I'm assembling because I have to be. But because of what the Hebrews writer says is we're coming into the assembly with our mind deliberate, that we're going to stimulate one another unto love and good deeds. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 24. Whenever the New Testament describes the church, it speaks of it in terms of a family. And all of our family experience is different. But think about time sitting around home, whether it's the father or the mother or the siblings, and there's laughter. There's shared memories in which it evokes joy in us. And that's how the Bible describes the church. And if you look in Acts chapter 4 and verse 32, their time together was marked by being with one heart and one soul. They loved being together. And that's an important part of being there for one another when there are times of grief. The New Testament church, even though persecution is going to come, even though they're going to have their difficulties, they spent time before the storms enjoying each other's company. Now, with that in mind, I want you to think about our congregation right now. How many folks, I don't know, maybe there's somebody in this room who takes the bulletin every week and counts the number, but how many folks do you think are on our sick and shut-in list? If you had to guess, 45. There are 45 people who make up that list right now. And, of course, you know as I do, how many are not listed that we could list? Maybe they, by their choice, don't want their names to be put down. Or maybe they have been suffering for so long that they have asked that their name be taken off. Some folks are very private and they don't want the difficulties that they live with to be shared. And you spread that over the size of this congregation, how many folks there are who are hurting in that way. Some of the folks on that list are not going to get better physically or mentally. You think about that? They have degenerative conditions that is ultimately, short-term or long-term, going to take their lives. How many of this number are facing an imminent loss of a loved one? Let's go back to January 1st. How many people in this congregation have lost somebody dear to them in these last now 7 full months? I would say, yeah, and every year is going to be the same. We're always going to have folks who are losing and hurting. And so God has us here to weep with each other too. Romans chapter 12 and verse 15. But if we're going to weep with those who weep, we've got to make the decision to. And that's what these friends do. There are several commands in the New Testament where the Bible is telling us as Christians to comfort. As Paul gets through with the second coming discussion that he has in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13, he says, I wouldn't have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, that you do not sorrow as others who do not have hope. And then he goes through and tells them what to expect. Do you remember how he ends that? What does he say? What's the period, the exclamation point at the end of that? Wherefore, comfort one another with these words. Now, that should be a natural outgrowth, but just not to leave it to chance, he is saying, in light of the fact that death is not the end for the Christian, that it's not defeat, that I want you to make sure that you actively reach out and provide comfort for people who may be struggling in the depths of their problems right now. That would be enough if we had that. But at the beginning of 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul inundates his readers with this idea of comfort. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 4, he says, comfort others in any affliction with the comfort with which you yourself are also comforted. Now, Paul's writing this, and Paul's not necessarily feeling an abundance of comfort. He is struggling. I think he's in one of the low points of his entire ministry life as a Christian. And yet his choice is to not only focus on the comfort that God gives, but he says to the saints there at Corinth, you find people to comfort in the same way that you've been comforted. Now, for just a moment, think about that as a reciprocal command. Think back to the last crisis that you had, a crisis of faith, a physical crisis, health, whatever it is, financial. Did somebody come along and provide comfort for you? And perhaps, and I want you to think particularly of a Christian who came along and helped you with perspective. Paul says, comfort others in the same way that you've received that. You know how it feels. You know what it does for you. Turn around and do that for someone else. Now, Paul is speaking somewhat conditionally, but he's making the same point in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 1 when he says, you know, if you've been the recipient of any comfort, fulfill my joy to be of the same mind. But since we are comforted, comfort others in love. And then in Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 1, God says through Isaiah the prophet, comfort, O comfort my people. You know, I wonder in times of this magnitude, it's easy for somebody to slip through the cracks. But shouldn't it convict us to never have a David among us who would say what he said in Psalm chapter 69 and verse 20, I looked for comforters and I found none. I'll tell you this, that church leaders and preachers will sometimes hear that, maybe other members as well. I went through this thing and nobody, what? Nobody called. Nobody came. Now, sometimes that's inaccurate and we forget. Maybe it's somebody specific that we wanted to be there and they weren't there. But it should never be legitimately the case that we have walked through the depths of a valley and nobody reached out to comfort us in the family of God. Now, some of the other things that we're going to see in Job chapter 2, verse 11 through 13 will help us to make the decision to comfort, but step one is to make up your mind in order to do so. Tell yourself this, comforting others is my responsibility even if nobody else does that. It's my Christian expectation. All right, so that's number one. Make the decision. Any thoughts on that before we move on? All right, number 2. Take others with you. You know, often in the Gospels, we see the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, and they're getting together. And that would be a good thing, except for the purpose for their doing that, it's not good. But Jesus understood this principle, didn't he? Didn't Jesus see the power of in numbers? Now, he's going to send everybody out individually at the end of after his resurrection in Matthew 28. He says, go into all the world. There's an individual responsibility. We're going to be talking about that in the worship hour this morning. But isn't there significance in Luke chapter 10 when Jesus sends them out 2 by 2 unto the lost of the household of Israel? Sometimes you have difficult tasks and nobody can do it with you. You have to walk alone in those times. But if you had a preference, wouldn't you rather? If you're having to do something difficult with somebody else, wouldn't you rather have somebody with you in order to maybe have some moral support, maybe think, I don't have the right words to say, and so hopefully the person that's going with me will have something that they can say. It's just an emphasis that the New Testament church gives us is we're not in this alone. And so even in unpleasant times like comforting other people, let's take somebody with us. And that's what the friends do. Think about the together passages that we read in the New Testament that emphasizes this importance of us being together. They pray together in times of crisis. In Acts chapter 4, verse 31, this is when Peter and John have been arrested for preaching Jesus. And they come back after having been chastised and punished by the religious leaders. And they come together and they have that prayer meeting. And there's this beautiful togetherness that is pictured in the church. Now, we usually focus on Ananias and Sapphira and their sin and they're being struck dead, and great fear came upon the church and they grew. But Acts chapter 5 and verse 12 says that you would think, wouldn't you? Let's say that the church that you attend, that God decided to take such a drastic action that 2 of the members were killed on the spot. Maybe you might be tempted to scatter. But Acts chapter 5 and verse 12 says that they were together. You think about Peter in Acts chapter 12. And John Mark's mother is hosting a prayer meeting in her house. And James, the brother of John, has been beheaded. And Herod saw that it pleased the Jews, and so he's getting ready to do the same thing to Peter. And so here's Peter, who is just waiting for his turn in prison, and they came together. You know, this is the man they heard preach the first and second gospel sermon, at least some of them. Here's the church at Jerusalem that's grown in at least some part due to his influence and his preaching. And this hero of the faith is now maybe on the chopping block. And so they come together. There's a big problem in the church. Gentiles are now receiving the gospel. And now they got to figure out, how does this work? How do Jews and Gentiles get together in this new system of religion that Jesus has established? What do? They come together to try to figure out what's God's will in this. And you'll also find it in the instructions. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 26, the Bible says, if one member suffers, then they all suffer together. Ephesians 2 verse 21, we are built together as a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. In Colossians chapter 2 and verse 2, Paul says that he wanted the hearts of the Christians to be knit together in love. Now, notice how the text says that the 3 friends made an appointment together. Wouldn't you like to have been there to hear the discussion? And that's obvious that the counseling material that they came up with wasn't the best. But they did come together, and they wanted to talk this through and to make a plan, and I think that's wise. If you have to go into a very difficult situation, don't you want to maybe take somebody with you and figure out, what are we going to do? I want you to think about some of the tragedies that face us in life and have faced us in this congregation. Financial collapse or loss of a job, death of a child, death of a spouse, or even death of a parent. How about public spiritual failings like adultery or unwed pregnancy or arrests? I mean, they can come from a lot of different directions, and people who are struggling in places and times like that need a right response. Heartbreaks like children who fall away or spouses who leave us. These tear us apart. And these become very lonely incidents. So I want you to picture this. What would happen? Maybe you've been a part of this. if you get on the phone, certainly not to gossip, but to say, hey, brother so-and-so is going through this. Why don't 2 or 3 of us drive over to the house and talk with them? Or be there. I've been on both sides of that. I've been in the car going to the place. And I've been in the house or in the hospital room when that group came in. And we don't have any idea. You know what we're thinking? As we're going in, we're thinking, I have no idea what to say. I'm going to just blow this. I'm sure of it. But you're the person who is sitting there holding the hand of somebody. You don't know if they're going to make it or not. And they come in and show their face. Just stay a minute or two and say a prayer. And you know what? If you're the one that's leading that prayer, you think, I have no idea. This is going to sound dumb, whatever comes out of my mouth. And if you're on the receiving end, it's one of the most blessed moments of your life. There is something to be said for us getting together and going to help somebody, because this may become a spiritual crisis in which people in their pain find themselves now in a fight for their faith. And what can we do if we go together for somebody? All right, take others with you. See, friends are doing a great job, aren't they? They made the decision. They go together. They bombard him all at once, and it's a good thing at this point. Number 3, feel with them. I want to notice that there are 4 statements, and I think there's probably more. There are 4 statements that are made here that show us that they weren't just meeting an obligation, but that their emotions were engaged. Now, that's not something you can fake. And sometimes we say that sometimes you got to act yourself into a better way of feeling. We may not have the warmest feelings about a situation or a person in that moment. But I promise you this, if you will go and you will try to comfort somebody when they're struggling, your feelings will grow as the result of your being there. So here they are. Walk through the text with me. In verse 11, it says that they showed him sympathy. And I think this is an interesting word. It's a word that means to show grief, to lament. It means to shake with excitement. It's the word that's found also in Psalm 69 and verse 20 when David said he looked for pity, but there was none. That word pity is our word here for sympathy. And often the word is translated to grieve for suffering and even to grieve for the dead. So when you read through the Old Testament, often when you see that they grieved for the one who was dead, it's this word right here. It takes emotional investment to grieve with hurting people, doesn't it? Number 2, they came to comfort him. Verse 11. This means to draw the breath, to groan. It means to be moved with pity. And it could describe the sound of a horse who is breathing pantingly. Linda, you've heard a horse do that, hadn't you? To breathe pantingly. That's a graphic picture. They determined to groan and to grieve before they even got to Job. And then you'll notice in verse 12, they raised their voice and wept. Now this is a very strong word. It depicts bitter and intense crying. It's a word that indicates a natural, spontaneous expression that you don't anticipate. Now there's some things that maybe you're watching a movie and there's a sad scene, and in the course of that, it builds, it wells, and then maybe you shed a tear. You ever had a situation to where something happened so intensely, so suddenly, that you just burst into tears? I mean, maybe the tragedy is so great or the situation is so dire that when you see it, in that moment, you can't help yourself. It just comes out. That's the word here. So you imagine the scene. Here they are. They're coming up on him. And it says they see him from a long way off and they're making their way. They don't even recognize him. It's so bad. And it says that they did this. They burst into tears. You ever been overwhelmed by grief, your own grief? You ever been overwhelmed by somebody else's grief? And then in verse 13, it says that they sat with him. We're going to say a little bit more about this in just a moment, but this is another tangible way for them to show that they're sharing their grief with him, that they feel with him. Now, there's other places in the Old Testament where we see that folks sit on the ground. And I don't know if there is a place in which it's said in a context other than sorrow and grief, but repeatedly In Isaiah 3 and verse 26, the daughter of God's people were to sit in the dust because of their sorrow. In Lamentations chapter 2 and verse 10, the daughter of Judah, the people of God who were now in captivity, they were to sit on the ground. And do you remember when Job comes and he says, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be destroyed? One of the responses, and it starts from the top, the king, it says that the king sat on the ground. Why? He thought in a little over a month everybody was going to be destroyed. And so here he is in his grief, feeling in such a way. You know, the Bible tells us that we're to feel for others. The difference we talk about between sympathy and empathy. Empathy is us putting ourselves in the shoes of someone else. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, Peter says, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. It shows us that the Christians took this seriously when we look at places like Hebrews 10 in verse 34. And one of the things the Hebrews writer says is that you showed sympathy for prisoners. Why did they do that? Well, the Hebrews writer may give us an insight when he says that we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with us. Now, the thing I thought was interesting, as far as I know, this is where those words, particular words, are found in the New Testament. 1 Peter and Hebrews. Anybody know what 1 Peter and Hebrews have in common with each other? What's kind of the setting of the context behind those books? What's happening to the recipients in 1 Peter and Hebrews? Yeah, you can say it more than a whisper. That's right. Persecution, right? They're paying a price for their faith. They're feeling sorrow. They're hurting. The Hebrews writer says you haven't yet resisted to the point of blood, but you have given up your possessions, knowing that in heaven you have a better possession. But they're feeling with others. The principle applies to us being good comforters. Whenever the pain arises, whatever the pain is, and one of the things that will drive us to comfort others is to feel sympathy. So how do we do that as Christians today? How do we feel with others in the congregation who may be struggling or hurting? You read a name in the bulletin, you automatically feel it. How are you going to build sympathy and empathy for others in the body of Christ? You got to get to know them. It's a whole lot different picture when they're not a stranger, but they're somebody that you've spent some time with. We got to get to know them in the times before the storm. Anything else?
Empathy is the ability to put yourself in their place. And that's difficult to do if you've been there. I don't know.
So draw on your own experience. Yeah, well, I think that helps. Are there some areas of life where you're more qualified to help somebody? So let's talk about the fact that there are mothers in this room who have miscarried. When you hear about somebody else who has, your circumstances may be completely different. But you come from a feeling that somebody else can't who hasn't been through that. I also believe that as we grow closer to Christ, we're going to begin to emulate Him. We're going to begin to feel more strongly for the people that are around us, no matter who they are to us. If they're in our inner circle of close associates, or even if they're not. Now, in this case, here may have been, we don't know, 3 of the closest friends that Job had on this earth. Poor fellow, if that's the truth. But as you see that, maybe they are coming from a place of relationship others didn't have. But we've got to feel for others who are going through those things. Number 4, invest the time. So we see that, don't we? How do we see that in verse 13, that these guys are investing the time? All right, so we've already noticed the fact that they've come for a long way. So they've come all the way to us, presumably, and they're there with Job now. And then what? Stop and think about that. When is the last time you, for 168 hours, did anything nonstop? Can you imagine sitting for 7 days and 7 nights on the ground with somebody in the state of condition that Job is in. I can't think of anybody sitting for a solid week with somebody who's suffering. Maybe if you have to be a caregiver for a parent or somebody who you don't know if they have another day, and so a day becomes 3 days, becomes 5 days, 7 days. It's very extraordinary. But here they are. These guys who aren't blood relatives, who have come from such a distance, sit down and they take the time to be with Job. What does that tell you about them? What does that tell you about them and him? They love each other. They care about him. He's a priority to them. In order to do something like that, it's got to be something that's important to you. By the way, 7 is the Bible number in a lot of different civilizations, but certainly through the Bible we see 7 is a perfect number. It's complete. And perhaps in addition to the actual literal expenditure of time, this is an expression of the friends to him that say, we are completely invested here. We see how great your pain is, and we want you to know that we are totally on your side. We're with you all the way. It was a customary period of grieving. Even before the giving of the law of Moses, you remember when Jacob dies in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 10, it says that Joseph mourned his father for 7 days. And so it's a timeless practice throughout different civilizations. But it's a reminder that how we spend our time is an indicator of what's important to us, what we value. These 3 men are telling Job, without even saying a word, how much he means to them. Now, when people are sick or in the hospital or they're grieving a loss or they're suffering a setback of some sort, taking the time to be there sends a very strong message. Now, a few instances call for a solid week, but what about a brief visit? Make sure the time is right and make sure that your presence isn't a hardship. It depends on what somebody, maybe they're feeling nausea or in such pain that it would be embarrassing for them. A lot of times that's the more exceptional. A lot of times a brief visit will be welcome. Use your common sense, but usually the sooner that you hear about something, the better. And another thing, of course, is don't overstay your welcome. Watch for cues. As you're there in the room and you see them, if maybe you see the discomfort or you see that it's not the best time, go ahead and wrap that up and leave. We're stewards of our time. And few uses of our time will be better than the time that we go and spend with somebody who is suffering. Invest the time. Number 5, be silent. Verse 13 says that no one spoke a word to him. You know, in situations where comfort is called for, we often feel inadequate to the task. We're going in and we say, I'm not sure what's going to be the best thing to say. The 3 friends model the very best response that you can make. You ever been in a suffering or struggling situation and people came and they were just there? They just sat around, maybe put their arm around you, and that was it? Wouldn't you say that in a lot of cases that was enough? That's just what you needed. In fact, it's their mouth that gets them in trouble. If you look over in Job 42 and verse 7, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends because you have not spoken to me what was right, and my servant Job did. Robert Alden said, good counselors know that sometimes the best thing they can do is simply listen. Just the presence of a sympathetic person can provide comfort altogether apart from spoken words. This probably was the finest demonstration of love that these 3 could have shown. If they had simply returned home without saying anything, their reputations would have been quite different. After the first round of speeches, all 3 of the men have spoken and Job has responded. Job then says in Job 13 and verse 5, oh, that you would have been completely silent and it would have become your wisdom. I don't know about you, but there have been times when I should have heeded that. And I said too much. Proverbs 17 says, he who restrains his word has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. You know the next part. Even a fool, when he keeps silent, is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he's considered prudent. You know, there's probably several things that encourage their silence. Maybe it was disbelief at the amount and the severity of the suffering that Job was going through. Or maybe it was a surprise at the change that had overcome Job because of the suffering. Later on, he's going to talk about how he once was esteemed and honored, and in every corner and facet of his life it had been replaced. The people that he would not have even noticed before want nothing to do with him now. What a change. Somebody who was full of such power, dignity, and influence, and now he's reduced to ashes on his head, sitting there in the dust. And maybe some of it's the great empathy and the sorrow they feel for thinking about the magnitude of the loss that he has suffered. There are situations that you face where there's no words. You can come up with your own. Think about going into a room where there's a beautiful little 8-year-old girl who had been involved in an ATV accident. Went into the water, into a little pond, and she had just been down too long. She was laying there like a little angel in the room with all of her family surrounding her. You would just think that she was sleeping and would wake up at any time. And she never did. And they knew it. You walk into situations like that all the time. You walk into a hospital room of some parents who have lost a little baby. What words are there for that? Or you walk into an examination room when someone's spouse has just received a terminal diagnosis. In Preacher and His Work, we had a unit in that's called the Preacher in Visitation. And there's this long list of do's and don'ts, these verbal miscues and fumbles. I knew somebody who had that and they died. You know, there's certain things that you just don't say when you go into a situation. A lot of times we put pressure on ourselves to say the just right thing. And maybe what we can do so often is just don't say anything. Just be there. And then finally, open your eyes. They saw that his pain was very great. You know, it's biblical for us to pray, Psalm 119 and verse 18, open my eyes. And one of the wonderful things that we understand out of his law is a passage like Job chapter 2, verse 11 through 13. What's one of the most effective tools that we have in comforting? It's our eyes. What do they need? How are they feeling? What are they looking at? What are they looking for? You'll notice in verse 12 that the friends first put their eyes on him. They lifted up their eyes from a distance, it says. They were already looking for how it was going to be for their friend. They were so moved. You'll notice that they wept for him, and now they kept quiet because they saw how much he was hurting. In comforting other people, it's so good for us to remember that in following this principle, we are following God himself. Think about Psalm 33, verse 18. Behold, the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those who hope for his loving kindness. Psalm 34 and verse 15. The eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. And 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 9. For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart are completely his. I suggest to you that true comforters are also keen observers of what's taking place in that situation. So we've come to the end of the class, and we have used the Bible's 3 worst comforters as our example. But their fault lies in what they say in response after Job goes through his suffering. You know, there's some things that they could not or did not know, and I think that was a problem. And sometimes we presume to know what people are going through. These friends did not know the why of the suffering, but they didn't need to. Number 2, they presumed that they could know, and as it turns out, they couldn't. And they lost sight of the only thing they needed to know is that the one who is in control of it all did know. Now, they tried to speak on behalf of God, but they did so inaccurately. But let us not miss what they do at the very beginning of this, and let it be a template. I believe if we follow those 6 things that they did on the front end, man, we will be meeting the Christian expectation that God has for us in the church. Will be much stronger as a result of that. This is 2 in a row. We're done. All right. Thank you for your attention.